There are really few things more dangerous than having the corporate media create propagandistic worlds in which 1 minute a fact that is affirmed overnight becomes a fact that gets denied. To have decade-long narratives about a country like Ukraine get completely rewritten, revised, and whitewashed with the specific and clear goal of having their reporting align with the security state of the United States and its war policies. And yet that is exactly what the US media has done. There is a new article in the New York Times today that very begrudgingly acknowledges a core truth about the situation in Ukraine. One that the Western press had spent a decade warning about, but then overnight, as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine and the United States government and other Western governments sided with Ukraine in that proxy war, just disappeared from public view. In fact, what had been long affirmed by the Western press for a decade became banned to express on the grounds that it was Russian propaganda or evidence somehow that you were aligned with or loyal to the Kremlin if you simply acknowledged it. A tactic that has become increasingly common. That is, in fact, the go-to tactic of the Western press to stigmatize dissent and to propagandize the public, to label all dissent disloyalty or proof of allegiance to the Kremlin, almost to the point of caricature. They do it. And yet allegations of disloyalty to your own country, to your own tribe, are inherently potent. And it has really been effective in keeping this flow of information about this war in Iraq, which, remember, even Joe Biden himself says has brought the world closer to nuclear Armageddon than at any time since 1962, to keep the flow of information about that war completely closed off from dissent. Now, let's look first at what the New York Times acknowledged today. The fact that they acknowledge it is significant. The way in which they acknowledge it and tried to frame it, though, is incredibly revealing about how propagandistic the Western press is when it comes to this war. So there you see the headline on the screen from today's article. And the headline reads, "Nazi symbols on Ukraine's front lines highlight thorny issues of history." Maybe we can bring up that headline onto the screen from the New York Times article. And the article reads, quote, "Troops' use of patches bearing Nazi emblems risk fueling Russian propaganda and spreading imagery that the West has spent a half-century trying to eliminate." So they're admitting that there are all sorts of Nazi emblems spread throughout the Ukrainian military. We've all seen them. They're not just posted from random trolls, but even Ukraine's government and NATO and Western media outlets have repeatedly got caught posting glorifying photos of Ukrainian military battalions and Ukrainian soldiers, only to be embarrassed when they learned afterward that the image that they were spreading and glorifying contained classic Nazi symbols. And I don't mean MAGA hats. I mean the real deal Nazi flags, imagery, and symbols from battalions who are explicitly loyal to neo-Nazi ideology. For a decade, the Western press has warned that the dominant faction, the best fighting force in Ukraine, are the Azov Battalion and allied groups that explicitly have adopted a neo-Nazi ideology. Now, maybe you're someone who doesn't care about that. Maybe you're someone who's happy to see neo-Nazi groups in Europe armed again, rearmed. Maybe you think this time that will work out well, unlike the last time when that happened, when Nazi ideology took root in Europe and began to be flooded with heavy weaponry. But regardless of your views on Ukraine and the war, we should want our media telling the truth, not rewriting history to suit government war policies, and that's exactly what this propaganda has been about. So let's look at what the New York Times admitted today and how they did it. Quote, "Since Russia began its invasion of Ukraine last year, the Ukrainian government and NATO allies have posted, then quietly deleted, 3 seemingly innocuous photographs from their social media feeds. A soldier standing in a group, another resting in a trench, and an emergency worker posing in front of a truck. In each photograph, Ukrainians in uniforms wore patches featuring symbols that were made notorious by Nazi Germany and have since become part of the iconography of far-right hate groups. The photographs and their deletions highlight the Ukrainian military's complicated relationship with Nazi imagery." Now, let me just stop there. Let's look at this phrase. Let's savor it. The Ukrainian military's complicated relationship with Nazi imagery. Do you think that if it came to any other group on this planet, especially one the New York Times was seeking to vilify instead of glorify, that they would describe that group's relationship with Nazi imagery as complicated? We generally don't regard an embrace of Nazi symbols and Nazi flags and Nazi mottos and Nazi slogans and Nazi ideologies as complicated. In fact, it's one of the most simple things there is when it comes to not only a moral framework, but a geostrategic one. We ought to avoid arming militias and battalions that have a relationship with Nazi imagery. But in this case, the New York Times need to justify it, needs to mitigate it. And so now it becomes complicated. You're going to see this kind of moral relativity throughout the entire article. Now, again, if someone in the West wears a MAGA hat, that becomes instant proof they're a Nazi. They have to be destroyed. They're not entitled to free speech. They're not entitled to due process. You can imprison them for months with no trial. And it's all justified because they're Nazis. But then when Western institutions meet actual Nazis, like the real deal kind, the kind that admire Nazi Germany and view classic Nazi collaborators as heroes and inspirations, neoliberal institutions in the United States want to arm and fund them and turn them into heroes. So here we see the complicated relationship that Ukraine's military has with Nazi imagery, a relationship forged under both Soviet and German occupation during World War II. That relationship has become especially delicate because President Vladimir Putin of Russia has falsely declared Ukraine to be a Nazi state, a claim he has used to justify his illegal invasion. Now, the fact that Russia asserts a particular thing to be true does not make it immoral to acknowledge its truth if it's actually true. If what the Russian government is saying is factually correct, the fact that your view aligns with the Russian government's does not make you a Russian propagandist or a Kremlin agent. It just means that you're both acknowledging the same fact. And the claim that Putin made when originally announcing his invasion, namely that there is a significant faction in the Ukrainian military and in Ukraine composed of Nazis, and that therefore part of that military operation is designed to denazify the Russian state or the Ukrainian state, is one that has been made over and over and over again by almost every major Western media outlet before this war, including, as we will show you, the New York Times. And yet now what they're essentially saying, the New York Times is the only reason it's a problem for Ukrainian militias and battalions to be enamored of Nazi ideology is not because it's inherently problematic that they're Nazis, but because it fortifies Russian propaganda. It makes Putin's claims seem valid. You know why? Because in this particular case, it happens to be. And the only thing you need to do to see that is to look at what the Western press has been saying for 10 years before the invasion, when they changed their story overnight because that fact became too inconvenient to admit any longer. The Times goes on, quote, "The iconography of these groups, including a skull and crossbones patch worn by concentration camp guards and a symbol known as the Black Sun, now appears with some regularity on the uniforms of soldiers fighting on the front line, including soldiers who say the imagery symbolizes Ukrainian sovereignty and pride, not Nazism." Try that, try that. Go out on the street if you're a conservative in the United States, proudly wearing Nazi symbols and Nazi ideology, and when your photo is taken and the New York Times publishes it, and every liberal journalist in this country demands that you get fired from your job and excluded from the financial system, try this excuse that the New York Times is accepting from Ukrainians wearing Nazi symbols. Oh, I don't interpret the swastika or the Black Sun or these other Nazi symbols as Nazism. I just interpret that as American sovereignty and American pride. Let me know if that works out, or if the New York Times is sympathetic to that claim when it comes from conservatives in the United States or in the West, as opposed to the Ukrainian battalion Joe Biden is dead set on arming into for all of eternity, it seems. The article goes on. In the short term, that threatens to reinforce Mr. Putin's propaganda and giving fuel to his false claims that Ukraine must be, quote, denazified, a position that ignores the fact that Ukraine's president, Vladimir Zelensky, is Jewish. Now, let me stop again here. What the New York Times is trying to tell you is that you don't have to worry about the fact that huge numbers of Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian people and Ukrainian battalions are openly embracing Nazi ideology because the president of Ukraine is Jewish. Now, what I want you to do is the next time somebody says that the United States has a problem with systemic racism, or that the United States is a country founded on white supremacy, claims that are extremely common, in fact, gospel in liberal discourse, I want you to say in response, well, of course that cannot be true, because after all, the president of the United States from 2008 to 2016, Barack Obama, is black. Therefore, it cannot be true that the United States is founded on an ideology of white supremacy, or that that ideology continues to be the predominant ideology in the United States. Or you can point out that not only is President Obama, who was elected and then reelected, black, but also the current Vice President, Kamala Harris, is as well. And therefore, that is a negation of the claim that the United States is a racist country. It seems to work here from the New York Times when it comes to Ukraine. I don't think that you would be very successful in arguing that when it came to similar claims about the United States. The article goes on. More broadly, Ukraine's ambivalence about these symbols, and sometimes even its acceptance of them. Okay, so the New York Times is acknowledging that Ukraine is ambivalent about Nazi symbols and sometimes even accepting of them. Seems like a pretty big deal to admit, given that that's the country that we are turning into one of the most well-armed countries on the planet. What is the concern the New York Times has about this fact, that Nazis are being armed and that might lead to very dangerous outcomes in the future? No. The concern is, quote, this risk giving new mainstream life to icons that the West has spent more than a half century trying to eliminate. Quote, what worries me in the Ukrainian context is that people in Ukraine who are either in leadership positions, either they don't or they're not willing to acknowledge and understand how these symbols are viewed outside of Ukraine, said Michael Coburn, a researcher at the investigative group Bellingcat, who studies the international far right. Are you surprised that the first expert, the apolitical neutral expert cited by the New York Times in this article, happens to be somebody from Bellingcat, who in a report that we broadcast 2 weeks ago that has been watched by almost 2 million people, was one that we documented is funded and shaped by the security state agencies of the West, the very governments that are behind the war in Ukraine. And here he is trying to say the only problem with it is not that these ideologies are pretty dangerous, Nazism that is, but that they have bad PR in the West, and it's really important to maintain good PR in the West so that the West continues to fund and arm Ukraine. In other words, the problem isn't that the Ukrainians are Nazis, the problem is they're being too candid about it. Quote, I think Ukrainians need to increasingly realize that these images undermine support for the country. Shouldn't they undermine support for the country? Shouldn't the fact that the leading fighting forces in Ukraine are filled with Nazis and people who have allegiance to Nazi ideology? Again, when I say Nazi ideology, you have to be very careful, because in Western discourse, that phrase has been so overused. That Trump is a Nazi, that Trump is the new Hitler, that the Trump movement is fascist, that they're based on white supremacy, has been asserted over and over, that those words have lost their meaning. You call someone a Nazi now, and it pretty much means they're a conservative, or someone who dissents from establishment orthodoxy, whether from the right or the left. But it does actually have meaning. There are real Nazis. There is such a thing as Nazi ideology, and these are the real adherents to it. And the only problem, according to the New York Times and their partners at Bellingcat, is that it creates bad PR for Ukraine. It's important to keep good PR from Ukraine so we can keep weaponizing them and funding them. So far, the New York Times says, the imagery has not eroded international support for the war. Why not? Why hasn't this imagery of what the New York Times describes as regular or frequent invocation of Nazi ideology and Nazi symbols by the Ukrainian military, why hasn't that eroded international support for the war? I should also point out that by international support for the war, the New York Times basically means the United States, Great Britain, and several Western European allies. Not very much beyond that. It has, however, says the Times, left diplomats, Western journalists, and advocacy groups in a difficult position. Okay, you would think by difficult position, what the New York Times means is that these diplomats, Western journalists, and advocacy groups are advocating that neo-Nazi groups be funded, and that's the difficult position. That's not what they mean. That's not the difficult position. What is the difficult position that they're in? Quote, calling attention to the iconography risks playing into Russian propaganda. Saying nothing allows it to spread. In other words, because it might be helpful to Russia to point out the truth, which is what journalists, above all else, are supposed to reveal so that you can decide what policies you support. Because that might help Russia, journalists are in a difficult position about whether or not they should admit these facts. This is the part that is most mind-blowing. Even Jewish groups and anti-hate organizations that have traditionally called out hateful symbols have stayed largely silent. Privately, some leaders have worried about being seen as embracing Russian propaganda talking points. Now, the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, used to be very open about the fact that they regarded the Azov Battalion as an extraordinarily menacing neo-Nazi group. They said it over and over, and now suddenly, because pointing that out might undermine the agenda of the US security state, groups that ostensibly exist to defend the Jewish people from anti-Semitism, but which in fact are really about advancing the interests of the Democratic Party, will no longer denounce actual neo-Nazi groups or raise concerns about arming them, because to do so would undermine Joe Biden's policy. Now, in case you think this is just some isolated cases of Twitter trolls on Ukraine, on Twitter or elsewhere, the New York Times says, in April, Ukraine's defense ministry posted a photo on its Twitter account of a soldier wearing a patch featuring a skull and crossbones known as the Totenkopf, or death's head. The specific symbol in the picture was made notorious by a Nazi unit that committed war crimes and guarded concentration camps during World War II. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry posted a photo glorifying soldiers wearing the exact symbols that Nazi units wore while they committed war crimes and guarded concentration camps during World War II. The patch in the photograph sets the Totenkopf atop a Ukrainian flag with a small number 6 below. That patch is the official merchandise of Death in June, a British neo-folk band that the Southern Poverty Law Center has said produces, quote, hate speech that exploits themes and images of fascism and Nazism. So you see, all the ingredients for what normally gets people destroyed are all present. Now, here's the tweet from the Defense Ministry of Ukraine, and there you see the photo with, unfortunately, what happened to be Nazi imagery, and Nazi symbols, the Totenkopf specifically. They ended up deleting it because it's kind of embarrassing that Nazi ideology and Nazi symbols are so pervasive in the Ukrainian military, the military that the United States government with your money is funding and weaponizing and arming, that they don't seem to be able to find photos of soldiers that don't have them. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.